Okay, so the final lecture for your transition semester is a really quick pediatric review. There's a lot in pediatrics that we cannot possibly cover in the scope of this class, but we are going to cover child development and some things that we do to adjust care when caring for kids. And then we'll talk a little bit about immunizations. Okay, so we're going to start with general principles of growth and development, and then we'll talk about infants. So in general, you need to remember growth and development tend to be cephalocaudal, proximodistal, simple to more complex. So what that means, I want you to think about fetal growth and an infant growth. Early in the embryonic period, the embryo develops a really massive head and a little tiny body, and then eventually that body starts to catch up, right? In fetal life, the head is larger in comparison to the body. As a newborn, the head is still significantly larger in comparison to the body than an older child or an adult. That's because the head grows first, and then everything else begins to grow to catch up. So cephalocaudal, proximodistal. I also want you to think about development. So the first thing motor-wise that newborns do is they start trying to control the head, right? And then they start to try to control the trunk. They are able to move the trunk a little bit, then arms, hands, and eventually fingers. So that growth and that development is cephalocaudal, proximodistal. The systems develop in embryonic life in very simple rudimentary forms, and then they become more differentiated and more specific. Children learn individual simple skills, and then they put those skills together to become more complex behaviors. So cephalocaudal, proximodistal, simple to complex. Always remember that when you're trying to figure out what comes first. Okay, so an infant, we're going to talk about physical development. Weight at birth has a lot more to do with, there's some genetic component. Big people tend to have big babies, small people tend to have smaller babies, but it has a lot more to do with placental perfusion than really anything else. So maternal nutrition, placental perfusion, what is that baby getting? That's the biggest factor. So after birth, that baby, if they're getting and absorbing adequate nutrition, will settle into a growth curve. So they may start out very large, cross a couple of percentile lines, and end up around the 50th percentile. Start out smaller, cross some lines, end up higher. They kind of fall, or they find their curve in the first couple of months of life. Typically by 6 months, weight has doubled. By a year, it's more or less, it's about tripled. And that's an estimate. But when you're looking at what should a 12-month-old weigh, you want to look at what their weight was at birth and triple that. Length grows faster in the first 6 months, and then it slows down. So it starts out about 1 inch a month, and then it slows down. There's a rapid growth in head circumference early in infancy, and then that slows down as well. Remember, they grow head first, and then the trunk, and then the extremities. Infants are prone to respiratory infections because their eustachian tubes are shorter and straighter than an adult, and that's until around 3 years old or so. After that, those respiratory infections tend to decrease for the most part. Now, there's some social influence on that. So kids, if they've not been exposed to a lot when they go to school, they get more infections, but infants tend to be more prone to respiratory infections. They also tend to get sicker with those infections than older kids. Their airways are smaller. They have less room for swelling and mucus and constriction. And their immune systems are not completely developed. So they tend to get sicker. Heart rate is typically 110 to 160 at birth when they're resting and awake. It slows over the first year, so the heart rate gradually slows down through childhood. Fetal hemoglobin is higher at birth. The red blood cell count is higher at birth, but red blood cells that are formed in fetal life have a specific type of hemoglobin called fetal hemoglobin, and those break down more quickly. That hemoglobin is gradually replaced with adult hemoglobin, but fetal hemoglobin suppresses formation of new red blood cells. I think it suppresses the erythropoietin, but it suppresses the release of new blood cells. So those blood cells break down, they break down, they break down. Eventually, enough of them break down, and the child around 4 to 6 or 3 to 6 months old develops a physiologic anemia. They become a little bit anemic, and that triggers making more red blood cells, and they begin to make red blood cells with adult hemoglobin. The digestive system of a newborn is immature. Breast milk is the most easily tolerated food, and formula is the only acceptable substitute. Iron fortified commercial infant formula, not homemade formula, not skim milk, not anything else. Breast milk or formula should be the entire diet, the only thing that child consumes for the first 6 months. At very minimum, the first 4 months, the first 6 months is recommended. Over the second half of that first year, foods should be gradually added. They should be added one thing at a time to see if the child tolerates them okay. But after 6 months, breast milk or formula should be the majority of that child's diet. If we replace frequently the foods that kids accept easily, that are easy to feed them, tend to be carbohydrate, not a lot of protein, not as many nutrients. And so if we're replacing breast milk or formula with a lot of poor nutrient carb foods, we're impeding nutrition. The baby can be weaned from formula to solid foods and whole milk at 1 year. Babies under a year old should not receive unaltered cow's milk, not whole milk or not skim milk. They need to be weaned from formula to whole milk at a year, no earlier. Breastfeeding can continue as long as both the mother and the child desire to do that. We have kind of a bias about breastfeeding too long in the US. In a lot of cultures, it's common to breastfeed even through the preschool years. There's no evidence that that is psychologically harmful, and it can be physiologically helpful. So as long as both the mom and the baby are comfortable with breastfeeding, it's fine. What typically happens is they're adding more foods and breastfeeding gradually decreases. Newborns have an immature immune system. That means they have an increased risk of infection. They're more likely to get sick, but also their symptoms are less apparent, especially those respiratory infections. What are the symptoms from? They're from your body's, your immune system trying to fight the infection. So their symptoms are less apparent, and so they may get very, very sick before we see that they're sick because their symptoms are harder to see. About the first month, they need some help with thermoregulation. Healthy newborns need about 1 more layer than we do for about a month. After that, their thermoregulation gets a lot more efficient, and they need to be dressed comfortably for the weather. Kidneys are immature. They don't concentrate urine as well as they will later. And water is a greater percentage of body weight. So a child that has decreased urine output is significantly dehydrated. They're more prone to dehydration. They have less to lose, and they'll continue losing water even when they're in mild dehydration because their kidneys just don't concentrate urine as well. Some major milestones for newborns. Now, if you look at a developmental chart in the first year of life, there's like 382 different milestones. That's the number I picked out of the air. There's a lot of milestones, and I don't want you trying to memorize all those. So the only ones that will be testable are the ones listed in your notes. Okay. And I want you to look at how they are. They tend to be cephalocaudal, proximodistal, simple to more complex. So at 2 to 3 months old, if you put something in a baby's hand, they have a reflexive grasp. They'll reflexively grasp it. They have a hard time letting it go. They have a hard time they can't get the signal to their hand and coordinate that to let it go, but they have a reflexive grasp. That continues over, they learn how to grasp things on purpose. Eventually, they can develop a pincer grasp by 8 to 11 months, okay? For gross motor, they have good head control. Usually by 3 months, they work on holding their heads up. They can roll front to back around 5 months, back to front around 6 months, sitting up around 6 or 7 months, and walking around 12 months. Now, I'm going to do a really quick disclaimer about development and milestones. It is very important for testing purposes that you look at the averages, okay? If you have children, or if you've been around children, you will have seen a lot of variation. I had a child speaking in full sentences at 13 months. I had a child who had 5 words at 2, and 3 of them were ball. Both of those were within the normal range of development. So we're not looking for what this kid did or that kid did. We're looking at what is the average. The average is probably by 18 months speaking 2 or 3 word sentences. Okay. So we want to look at 18 months to 2. That may be actually a little bit early, but we want to look at average. Okay, so you're going to be tested on what's on here. Okay, so infant psychosocial development. I really, really want you to work to understand the Erikson's theory of development. Erik Erikson observed his own children, developed this theory. There's a lot of controversy about it because it's all based on his own kids who were all male, but it does seem to have a good bit of practical application. So Erikson identified an essential conflict in each stage of development that needs to be resolved successfully to move on to the next stage of development. So in infancy, that is trust versus mistrust. And what that means is an infant needs to develop a basic trust in the world as a safe place, a trust that their needs will be met. And if they develop that, they're able to bond with others, or they're able to move on and develop independence in toddlerhood, which is that next stage, okay? If they don't, if their needs are not met and they don't develop that trust, they may not be able to attach to others, and they're going to have a really hard time developing independence because they're always going to be focused on those unmet needs. So how can parents promote trust? By meeting the infant's needs, okay? Attachment to a primary caregiver or caregivers is important. And so interacting with the child, talking to them. Some parents have been told those things are spoiling, but meeting those needs and interacting with that child is actually promoting their development. So we want to encourage that attachment. Most infants have a high need for physical contact. They need lots of holding and snuggling, lots of touching. They often express their needs by crying, but if we respond consistently to their needs, then they begin to express those needs in other ways. They begin to let us know when they need something without crying. Separation anxiety and stranger fear are common and normal. Usually somewhere about 8 months or so, they begin to grasp that their caregiver, their grown-ups are not actually part of them, that they are separate beings. And that gets scary because then if they're separated from that person, they're afraid they've disappeared forever. So that separation anxiety, stranger fear is a sign of solid attachment. It's a healthy thing. So what do parents do? What can we teach parents about what to do when they have to go to work and their kids cry every time they leave them at daycare? One thing that can be helpful is that alternate caregivers need to be as consistent as possible. So instead of having 16 different people that we leave the baby with, we need to have one or two consistent people. Now, parents need backup childcare, and so those backup options ideally are also people who that child knows and can develop some comfort with. We just want as much consistency as possible. We also want to, we don't want to just disappear on that baby. We want to make sure that they know the parent is leaving, even though, yes, they're going to cry. Hi, bye-bye, I'm going to work now. I'll see you later. And then when we return, the child is learning to trust that when the caregiver leaves, they'll return. Okay. So that's a normal phase. Infants experience the world primarily as sensation. According to Piaget's theory of cognitive development, they're in the sensory motor stage. They experience the world through their senses. That makes sense, right? Because they're always touching and grabbing and licking and sticking things in their mouths, because that's how they learn about the world and that's how they experience the world. Around 8 to 9 months, they begin to be aware of others as separate beings. And that's what triggers that separation anxiety piece. Some anticipatory guidance. The concept of anticipatory guidance is one you need to know when we talk about pediatrics. And that's when healthcare professionals look at where that child is going next developmentally, and we give the parents some guidance about what to expect and maybe how to deal with that. So for feeding, we're going to talk about, remember those first 6 months, breast milk or formula. After that, we add foods gradually and observe their response. We want to talk about choking hazards and things like that. For sleep, we need to make sure that parents understand broken, interrupted sleep is normal for infants. They typically don't sleep through the night for several months, and sleeping through the night is defined as 5 hours uninterrupted. So that's still a very short night for adults. So the expectation that a baby is going to sleep 12 hours without any interaction from an adult is not realistic and probably not very healthy. So we can help them prepare for that with that understanding. There are some things that parents can do to help babies be able to sleep better. But some people just are good sleepers and some don't sleep as well. Some people struggle more with sleep. One of the things that can be done is to have a regular nighttime routine and then try to put the baby to bed when they're still awake. Bonding, we want to encourage parent bonding. We want to encourage parents to respond to their baby's needs and to interact with them. Babies learn to communicate in the first year, and they do that by interaction with adults and by mimicking the people around them. So bonding, communication, interaction, play. Infants learn by play, and we want to teach them the appropriate toys. When we're looking at toys for babies, safety is the #1 consideration. So we look at safety hazards. We don't want long cords that can get wrapped around the neck. We don't want choking hazards, things like that. But also we look at what that child is able to do developmentally and what their next step is developmentally. So I want you to think of some common baby toys and how they can promote development. So think about blocks. Blocks can, a young baby may be practicing that grasp with the blocks, and then they might be able to pick up 2 blocks and bang them together. Eventually, they start to be able to stack the blocks, so that blocks are something that grows with that child's developmental level. There are some toys that are really useful in one developmental stage, and then they kind of leave those behind. Toys don't have to be educational or have bells and whistles or lights or anything like that. Babies are just as happy and learn a lot just by interacting with simple toys. Discipline for infants. Parents need an understanding of what infants are developmentally capable of. They are not capable of empathy. So an older infant may hit, scratch, bite, pull hair, because they don't understand that other person can be hurt. They don't understand that they're hurting someone. So we can begin teaching, ouch, that hurts, don't hit. But that's not something that they're doing with the intention of hurting others. Sometimes parents think of crying as a discipline issue. Crying is an attempt to communicate. So if we're teaching parents about developmentally typical behavior or developmentally normal or expected development, that can help them figure out how to socialize their kids into society later on. Later in the first year, babies can understand the word no, but they don't consistently obey that. So they begin to understand that no means don't touch that, but they don't have the impulse control to not do it. So a lot of discipline is about repetition and teaching in the first year. Physical punishment is not encouraged. Repetition, teaching, and the parents need to set the environment up to be safe. Safety, anticipatory guidance, we need to look at suffocation hazards. Infants should be sleeping in their own sleeping space with nothing on that bed except a fitted sheet. So the infant needs to be dressed warmly enough in clothing that can't get loose and tangled up around them, warmly enough for the environment. So blankets and pillows and stuffed animals and bumper pads and all those things increase the risk of suffocation. If parents are going to bed share, we cannot recommend bed sharing, but if they're going to bed share, there are things that make that more dangerous. It is actually more dangerous to sleep with an infant on a recliner or a couch. They can, it's easier for them to get trapped in a crevice and suffocate. Infants should not be co-sleeping or bed sharing with anyone besides the parents. No other children in the bed. There needs to be a firm mattress, just a sheet, no blankets, pillows, etc. All of, and no one in the bed should be sedated. No one in the bed who has a sleep disorder that may make it more difficult to wake, and obesity is a risk. Mostly because of the increased weight depresses the mattress more, and so there's a space for the baby to roll into. SIDS is different from suffocation. There are things that decrease the risk of SIDS. There are things that increase the risk of SIDS. So we want to teach parents the things that increase that, that decrease that risk. Smoking increases the risk of SIDS. So we want to encourage parents who smoke to do so outside, wear different clothes or put on a jacket when they're smoking that they can take off when they come in the house. Having the room too warm or the baby dressed too warmly increases the risk. So we want to teach about that. A pacifier use may increase the risk of ear infections, but it decreases the risk of SIDS. And so we might encourage pacifier use. Strangulation, think about toys with long strings, think about blinds, cords, anything that can get wrapped around the baby's neck and cause strangulation. Foreign body airway obstruction. If it can go through a paper towel or toilet paper tube, it is small enough to get into the baby's airway and cause obstruction. So it's usually easier to avoid those things being around with the first baby when you have a toddler and a baby, or an older kid and a baby, then you may have, the Hot Wheels tires and the Barbie shoes and the marbles and all those things laying around that can be choking hazards. Also, when we start feeding infants, we need to make sure that food is soft enough to mush with the gums and that there's not hard pieces that they can break off. Those, not the toast, but the baby cookies, the teething biscuits, those things are a choking hazard. They gnaw on them long, they're pretty hard, so they gnaw on them long enough and a piece can get, they get soft enough for a piece to break off. So that's one potential issue. If you look at like the Gerber baby puffs, those dissolve almost instantly. That's so that they don't become a choking hazard. So we want to think about that. MVA, infants should be in a rear-facing car seat, properly installed and properly buckled in. One thing is that the chest plate goes on the chest, not the abdomen. They need to also be buckled into that car seat without extra blankets and jackets. So if it's cold weather, they need to be buckled in the car seat that is adjusted for them in regular clothes, and then they can be covered with a blanket or something if it's cold. Buckled in the seat every single time they ride. Drowning, don't leave infants alone in the bath. Even if they can sit up, if they fall over, they're too top heavy to be able to sit back up easily again. Once they're mobile, then parents need to be looking at things like mop water, kiddie pools, toilet, things like that. Because again, if they fall over, they're top heavy and they can't get out. And falls. There was a whole Twitter thread about this last week. A surgeon was insistent that it's impossible for a 3-month-old baby to roll over, so it's not necessary to pull up the crib rail. I am here to tell you that it is not physically impossible for a 3-month-old to roll over. First of all, as the mom of 6 kids, never mind being a nurse. But also, babies don't just roll. They scooch, they wiggle, they accidentally flip over one time and then don't do it again for 6 months. You don't ever leave a baby unattended on a surface that's not guarded. Baby's on the changing table. Everything needs to be in reach. You don't step away to get the diapers and the wipes, okay? Babies on adult, I know that my generation and older, it was really common to put a baby on the adult bed to take a nap. They'll roll or crawl right off that edge. So don't leave babies unattended. Bouncy seats, if they get that thing bouncing, they can bounce it right off the counter. So the bouncy seat needs to be on the floor. The same thing with those bumbo seats. There's some question about whether they can be harmful to the spine anyway, because they're holding the baby in a position they're not strong enough to be in yet. But also, babies are top heavy. If they're sitting in that bumbo seat and they lean forward too far, they can flip it over and flip it off of the counter. So no unattended babies on high surfaces. All right, that's all for infants. The next section will be about toddlers.